Here are the parts included in your ARC PDW stock kit. You have the stock assembly, the forward buffer tube. Please take note that there is a slot machined on the tube that cuts through the threads on one end of the tube only. The rear buffer tube, the inner buffer spring, the outer buffer spring connector, and the buffer. On the bottom of the base of the stock assembly, there is a button. This will lock the buffer back inside the buffer tubes for easy disassembly. I need to make two important points before we get started. First, we've encountered some bolt carriers, typically from inexpensive AR-15 rifle build kits, that are out of spec. The hole in the rear of the bolt carrier is too small for our buffer. This is an example that we found, and the buffer simply does not drop in. It needs to fit all the way up to the flange. So you must take the bolt carrier you will be using in your build and test fit the buffer in the kit before assembling the rifle. It needs to drop in and should rotate smoothly without any binding. Once you've checked that, you know that your bolt carrier is in good shape. Otherwise, the only solution is to replace the out-of-spec bolt carrier. Next, it's important to point out that you cannot use a single point of contact spanner wrench when installing the ARC stock. These single point of contact spanner wrenches are great tools for your standard steel castle nuts for buffer tubes. However, even though this rear buffer tube is made from a very high strength aluminum alloy, it will still distort when the correct amount of torque is applied with a single point of contact spanner wrench. Instead, you need to use a spanner wrench with 3 points of contact. Now we're ready to begin assembly. As with all firearms maintenance procedures, we begin by unloading the firearm and rendering it safe. We'll begin by removing the buttstock and buffer tube. Begin by sliding the lock pin and opening the action. Using a tool, depress the buffer detent and remove the buffer and the buffer spring. We will not be using these parts during the reassembly with the ARC PDW stock. Set them aside and save them for a later build. Now, using a spanner wrench, loosen the castle nut and unscrew it down to the end of the threads. Carefully back the buffer plate off the back of the lower receiver. Some of you may have the lock pin detent spring now protruding out the back of the lower receiver. It is important through the remainder of this procedure you take care not to bend or damage that spring. Now, using that tool, depress the buffer detent again, keeping it clear of the buffer tube while you unscrew it and remove it from the lower receiver. Set aside the stock, the buffer tube, and the buffer detent and spring. Again, these will not be used with this PDW stock. Now, take the forward buffer tube and install it into the rear of the lower receiver, threading in the end that has the threads that have not been cut by the slot. Install it until it is flush with the inside of the buffer extension. A helpful trick is to use the straight portion of the buffer as a stop. Once it's flush with the inside of the buffer extension, locate that machined slot on the outside of the tube, and rotating it to unscrew or counterclockwise, stop as soon as that slot reaches the bottom position. Now, take the stock assembly, and you'll notice that there is a locating pin and the tip of the buffer lock button protruding on the inside of the bore. These align with that machined slot in the forward buffer tube. Slide them on, and again, taking care not to damage your lock pin detent spring, bring the base of the PDW stock assembly forward to the rear of the lower receiver. While holding in position, operate the buffer lock button to make sure it operates freely. If it binds or catches, you may have the forward buffer tube installed too deep by one turn or not far enough by one turn. Experiment until you find the correct location. Once that buffer lock button operates freely, it's in the correct location. Now install the rear buffer tube on the back of the forward buffer tube. And again, using a 3-point contact spanner wrench, tighten the rear buffer tube to between 10 and 15 foot-pounds of torque. At this point, you're left with 4 parts from your PDW stock kit. You have the outer and inner buffer springs, the buffer spring connector, and of course the buffer. Place the buffer spring connector inside the outer buffer spring and the inner buffer spring inside the buffer connector, and then the buffer, urethane bumper end first, inside the inner buffer spring. Take these parts, insert them into the buffer tubes, and compress. And once they're compressed inside the tubes, hold the buffer lock button up and slowly release the buffer. It will lock against the buffer lock button, and hold it in place. Now close the action, lock it, and the first time you charge the rifle, you will feel or hear the buffer snap into place inside the rear of the bolt carrier.